Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. So this is myself Neeraj Kumar. I'm from the Civil Services of 2012 batch. I was in the Defense Account Service. So today we are here before you in our series of discussion on the recent reports which are coming out from some global agencies and of course from some prominent government institutions. So this report is the Global Assessment Report which is brought out by the UNDRR, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. This agency UNDRR it was created in 1999 to ensure that there is a coherent approach towards disaster management when we talk of countrywide or when we talk of worldwide management of disasters, because it was realized in the 90s in that disasters are often having their influence across borders. They are not limited to one country. So global cooperation in this field is very, very essential. So the UN came up with a body called UNDRR. It is headquartered, it was established in 1999 and headquartered in Geneva. So this body brings out a biennial report. Every 2 years it brings out a report on global assessment of the threat perceptions and hazard, risk, etc. related to disasters which are likely to occur. Okay, so this year's 2021 global assessment report on disaster risk reduction, it is focused upon a theme called drought. Okay, we all know what is drought. So it is specifically focusing upon the theme called drought as a disaster. So we will talk about the report's important theme, that is drought. What are the important issues related to it? How the GAR, how the UNDRR is looking at drought and what are the important things which it looks into. Then the report has gone through a case study in India, that is an area which is more prone to droughts in India, mostly the Decan and the surrounding areas. So we will have a look at that, in very brief, we will have a look at that case study. Then we will talk about how the report is talking about linking disaster called drought with the Sendai Framework. Okay, we all know that the Sendai Framework for disaster risk management was adopted in 2015. So we will also have a look at, in very brief, what are the important objectives and principles behind the Sendai Framework. Okay, so these are the important things which we'll be going through in this short session. Now, let us move ahead. Global Assessment Report. So I told you that the report is brought out by the UNDRR. Okay, it is biennial. Okay, and what is its aim? Its aim is to come out with an important with a disaster which has some global footprints and which, if not managed well, will result into a lot of catastrophic impacts on the environment as well, on the human beings, so on the overall well-being of human beings, isn't it? So that is the overall aim of the Global Assessment Report. Okay, so if you talk of the exact declared aim, to focus on international attention on issue of disaster risk and encourage political and economic support for disaster risk reduction. So basically we know that disaster is what it is, basically the meeting of a hazard with vulnerability. Okay, so when people are not well prepared and a hazard strikes, which is hazards are likely to happen always, isn't it? Natural hazards or some accidents due to anthropogenic activities, they are most likely to happen. Now what happens when we are not prepared enough, when we make ourselves vulnerable, then that hazard turns into a disaster, isn't it? So the very basic of disaster management is what we need to mitigate. So in a disaster management cycle, we know that there are pre-disaster and post-disaster. Okay, and it is a cyclic process, pre and post-disaster. So before a disaster actually strikes, we have to carry out risk assessment, Okay, then we have to carry out risk assessment, which will involve assessing the vulnerability. I hope you all are aware of the risk vulnerability. I'm not going to go through all those basic details about it right now, because it is assumed that you are aware of all those things. We need to know about risk, we need to know about vulnerability, we need to know about coping capacity, isn't it? So risk assessment, vulnerability mapping, those things are done. Then the most important activity which the government will be doing is mitigate the risk. Okay, because disaster management, when we say, it means one very important thing. Disaster management means management of risk which is being caused by disaster. It is basically minimization of the risk which is being caused by the disaster. That is the most important aspect of disaster management. So we will do the risk assessment and mitigation measures will be taken. Okay, mitigation measures will be taken. Then warning before the disaster is likely to strike. Early warning is an extremely important part. So these are before the disasters strike, and then after the disaster you have the immediate aid which is required, recovery, you have rehabilitation, then of course restoring it to normalcy, then development. So there are short terms, immediate relief, then you are restoring things, then you are rehabilitating people, and then you are doing some developmental effort, and finally you are bringing back to normalcy. So that completes the cycle, and after that another disaster might strike. So in this disaster management cycle, these pre-disaster efforts are extremely important to ensure that the risk is minimized and the damage, if at all the disaster is striking, is minimal. Okay, but what happens, many people are not in a position to spend or even think about mitigating a disaster. Mostly disaster management has been seen as a reactive step. Why? Because it requires money, it requires resources, it requires planning, it requires participation of people, it requires participation of different stakeholders, it requires technology, it requires research, isn't it? So many things are required, and many times, especially when we talk of the countries like India or the tropical countries, the less developed countries, they are the ones which are more prone to disasters. They don't have the resources available. As a result, they often are entangled into a vicious cycle of poverty and immediate pressing issues. So they are not having this foresight, they are not having this luxury of planning for disaster and then taking a preparatory step. So they are mostly reacting to disasters, and then they are losing out both ways, isn't it? They are already poor and they lose out more resources when actually a disaster strike them. Okay, so one of the very important steps which is required in managing disasters is getting the political support for pre-disaster steps, motivating governments to take precautionary measures, because investing 1 rupee in planning will save hundreds of rupees if we are struck by a disaster. The more we sweat in peace, the less we bleed in war. This is the very famous adage, isn't it? So that is one of the important objectives of this global assessment report. Every time they bring out this report, and through that they are trying to encourage more and more people, to more and more governments, more and more political entities to participate in the disaster management process and bring the Sendai framework into play, align it with the sustainable development goals. These are the important things which you need to be very, very clear on when you're talking about disaster management today. Okay, so UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, I was telling about this, located in Geneva. This is not very important for your mains exam, that where is it located, when it was established, but sometimes for prelims it might be relevant. Okay, now what does this GAR and this UNDRR do? They contribute towards monitoring of risk reduction, policy formulation and execution of disaster risk mitigation policies. This is the most important function which this body is doing, and it is trying to pursue the SDG agenda. Remember the sustainable development goals which we have adopted from 2015 to 2030. The SDG goals which we have adopted from 2015 to 2030, they are also running parallel to this Sendai framework. We will have a brief look at the Sendai Framework also towards the end. Okay, so they are trying to align the implementation of disaster risk mitigation measures, implementation of the Sendai Framework in line with the sustainable development goals. Remember, because many times when our development measures are not sustainable, they also result into disasters. Okay, for example, we are cutting down the slope of a hill for making a road, we are deforesting, we are causing a lot of you can say raising of those forests and the pristine areas. What happens? One, it is not sustainable because forests are limited, isn't it? Two, it also makes that hill slope vulnerable to landslides and many other disasters, isn't it? So sustainable development is quite intricately linked with the disaster mitigation also, okay, risk mitigation. So that's how these are the important things which you need to know about the global assessment report. Okay, so now this year what it has done is it has okay, so this year what it has done is it has brought the special report on droughts. Okay, so this year's report is talking about droughts. Now first of all, what is the definition of drought? Okay, so the definition of drought, the India's the IMD has a different approach to it, though it is similar, and the international this IPCC, it has its own definition of droughts. Okay, we know that there is an IPCC which is working on climate change, isn't it? National Protocol on Climate Change, and the IMD, the Indian Meteorological Department, is working on climate and all these issues, meteorological issues in India. So drought has been defined by the IPCC. Basically, the IPCC says that when there is a deviation from the general standard atmospheric you can say moisture, and it is they have defined it more in terms of hydrological features. Okay, they have talked about moisture and atmospheric circulation. When we talk of the IMD, okay, if you look at the exact definition, the IPCC defines a drought as a period of abnormally dry weather long enough to cause a serious hydrological imbalance. Okay, dry weather long enough to cause serious hydrological imbalance. Serious hydrological imbalance. Okay, now I was telling that in India the IMD defines droughts in multiple ways. So India, the IMD says it can be either hydrological drought, okay, or it can be meteorological drought, or it can be agricultural drought. Okay, due to shortage of rainfall or decline in the moisture, or if the field is not having sufficient moisture for growing the kind of crops which are grown. So that is an agricultural drought. So any kind of drought, ultimately it is dangerous for the farmers, for food security, for the economy, and several things. We will talk about all those impacts of drought. Okay, now drought and water scarcity. Drought is not essentially scarcity of water. Okay, it is not essentially scarcity of water. It can be agricultural drought. Water is not scarce, but for a crop which is being grown there, it is less, isn't it? So drought is more condition, it is more related to the hydrological imbalance rather than essentially scarcity of water. Okay, now what are causes of drought? There are multiple causes of drought which have been identified. If you look at the report, it has said that there are persistent atmospheric circulation changes. Okay, So this global assessment report, it has brought out that changes in the atmospheric circulation, okay. So the global assessment report has held atmospheric circulation, the changes in the patterns, as the most important factor for causing a drought, because it is defining drought through hydrological imbalance only. It is not looking at agricultural drought and those things. So it is talking about atmospheric circulation, okay. So we need to know it very, very clearly, because in the prelims also there can be a question that which of the following is the main factor for drought as per the global assessment report, something of this sort, okay. Then the future drought risk in the context of global change, the report has brought out the future drought risk, okay. So it has said that globally, what is the percentage of the world which is prone to. So globally, more than 60% of the world population, okay, world, the forests and croplands and pastures, they will be exposed to high drought frequency and severity. So we are talking about two aspects: frequency as well as severity, okay. So these two. Now a disaster, it damages us in two ways, isn't it? One, a disaster is not very serious, not very severe, but it keeps on occurring and we are not able to prevent it, something like flood. Even if it is not severe, it does disrupt our life for quite a you can say quite a period, isn't it? Say 15-20 days you are displaced from your place. It is very, very pathetic situation if we are not able to manage it. Frequency is one problem. Second is severity. Suppose there is a flood which does not occur every year, but 4 years or 5 years or 10 years down the line it occurs one time and it destroys everything, okay. So that is also bad. And the worst part is, suppose you are having frequent floods and that too they are very severe. Just imagine the damage. So droughts also, if they are very frequent, if they become more frequent and they become very severe in the sense that the lack of moisture, the deviation from the standard atmospheric circulation patterns is too big, it causes a lot of damage, for say cropping patterns. You cannot grow any crop in such kind of period unless you are growing something which is very dry. It may not be suitable to the soil. So there are many things which come into play. The point is that the increasing frequency and severity of droughts has been highlighted by the global assessment report, and it says that more than 60% of the world, the forests and the grazing lands and all those areas, they will be facing more severe and more frequent droughts over the period of time, okay. And if we are not taking the appropriate measures, then no one can stop from desertification, isn't it? Desertification is another big challenge, okay. So drought risk reduction and risk management is what is being focused by this report, the UNDRR, okay. So basically it says that we need to shift from a reactive strategy towards drought to a preventive strategy. What has been the response of governments or the state till now when we talk of droughts? We have been reactive, and not only reactive, we have even been slow in declaring droughts in most cases, and we react only when already a lot of damage is done, okay. Now remember one very important point: droughts, if we are not responding in time, if we are not taking action in time, it creates not only a problem for that period when rainfall or moisture is low, it disrupts the entire cycle. How? Suppose this is the sowing season, okay. Now right now we are not in the sowing season, we are in the middle of the Rabi season, okay. 2 months later there will be harvesting, or next month itself in March, April, harvesting will be there, isn't it? That is why we have the harvesting festival of Baisakhi in April, right? And so in the sowing season, suppose drought has struck or somewhere between. Now what happens? You are not able to grow the crop in this season. So it does not affect only that season, but the entire cycle, because the farmers, they are not getting the harvest of this season. They are not getting the surplus. They are not getting food. So their land remains fallow, and there are many other things which happen. They are not able to pay off their debt. They are not able to pay off their loans. So that creates a ripple effect on different other aspects of agriculture which are often neglected or ignored. Even when the governments give relief, they are giving relief only for that temporary period, but not for the entire period. So as a result, what happens that this risk reduction and risk management, it assumes enormous proportions when we talk of droughts also as a disaster. It should not just be reactive. So what do we need to do? We need to look into the areas, where disasters like these droughts, when we talk specifically of droughts, we need to look at areas which are drought prone, and we need to plan accordingly, early warnings and all those things. The strategy we'll be discussing towards the end. So the focus has been shifted towards risk reduction and risk management. Even in this report, they are talking about that. Okay. Okay. So the steps of drought policy and preparedness. Now this is something quite factual. You can just go through it. The report, it has talked about 10 steps of integrated drought management program. It has it starts from appointing a national drought management policy commission. So you create an institution first of all to look into the issue. Then you define the goals. What do you want to achieve as a nation when you talk of risk based national drought management policy? Okay. Then include all the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in this process? The farmers, the producers of other things, the water bodies, they are managed by some state government or central government or local bodies, whosoever are the stakeholders. Okay, your engineers, the PWD, irrigation, all of them take on board, NGOs working in the field of environment, agriculture. Then inventory data and financial resources to identify and broadly identify groups at risk. You will have to create an inventory database of what are the risks, what are the people who are vulnerable, who are they, how do we need to address their concerns. Then write the key tenets of the national drought management policy and preparedness plans following the 3-pillar approach. So what is this? So we will now write down the policy. Okay. So now we will have to write down the policy of this integrated drought management policy. And what will be the 3 pillars? The pillars will be reduction of risk, managing reducing the vulnerability, and of course it will be increasing your monitoring your performance. So drought monitoring and early warning is the first pillar. Then drought vulnerability and impact assessment, and lastly it is preparedness and mitigation and response. So 3 pillars of disaster risk reduction. Then identify research needs. So we have prepared the policy. Now for this, whatever research is required, we will do that. Then integrate science and policy aspects of drought management. We will do research. Whatever we find there, we will integrate that with the policy. Then publicize the policy and build awareness. Very, very important. If people are not aware, they will not be accepting what the government will be doing during the disaster management program. So people need to be made aware of what is a drought, how they are being affected, how they need to participate in this process, what will be the benefit of it, all of that. Okay. Then develop education programs for all age and stakeholder groups, right? So develop education programs, because for awareness we need education programs. And lastly, evaluate and revise policy and supporting plans. So last will be whatever we have done, evaluate that, and if required make some adjustments and make supporting plans to effectively implement the main plan. That is how this 10-pronged strategy of disaster integrated drought management policy is brought out by the GAR. Okay. Okay, so we were talking about the 3 pillars. These are the 3 pillars. Okay, the IDMP approach comprises of 3 pillars of integrated drought management: drought monitoring and early warning systems. This is very, very important. This is also an important component of the Sendai Framework, the early warning systems. Then drought vulnerability and impact assessment. Okay, what is vulnerability? I hope all of you know. When we expose ourselves with weaknesses towards a hazard, we are vulnerable, isn't it? Then drought preparedness and mitigation and response. So first of all, early warning. Okay, then you have an assessment of how many people are vulnerable, what will be the impact, and then you will have to plan accordingly what we need to do to reduce that or mitigate that vulnerability and the impact which is likely to occur. Okay, and of course the response if finally the drought has occurred, what kind of measures will be required. Now the GAR also talks about a case study based on India. They have gone through the Deccan Plateau and they have brought out some important things about the Deccan Plateau. So the Deccan region sees the highest frequency, that is greater than 6% of severe droughts. Now we all know the Deccan part is one of the most vulnerable because of various reasons. First, the monsoonal rainfall is less in comparison to other parts of the country. Many times it is lying in the rain shadow area, leeway side, isn't it? Not on the windward side. And more importantly, what happens is wherever the monsoon rainfall is less, it is also highly variable. When we know the variability of monsoon, we know that in areas where monsoon rainfall is high, the variability is also less. So with declining rainfall, the increase in variability also there. So vagaries of monsoon are also very much into play when we talk of drought prone areas like Deccan. Okay, and plus there are also so many things about the soil patterns over there and the overall the heat which is created, not only the rainfall, the heat which is there in the Deccan Plateau, it gets heated up, isn't it? So all those geographical factors and things, they are ultimately culminating into the effect that is more than 6% of severe droughts in the country are caused in this Deccan Plateau region. Now the impact of severe droughts on India's GDP is estimated to be about 2 to 5% per annum of GDP. So very big, isn't it? 2 to 5% per annum of GDP is lost just because we are having very severe droughts in Deccan Plateau and some other parts of the country. The Drought Declaration is the most important step in governmental response. What is happening? The government is often not declaring drought in the appropriate time. What happened during the pandemic? One of the biggest problems was that the WHO did not declare COVID-19 as a pandemic for a long time. Okay, so first of all, if we do not acknowledge that we are in some crisis, we are facing some disaster, how will we manage it? How will we respond it? Because the moment the government declares that we are through a disaster, they will have to give a lot of compensation and all those things to the farmers. So they often delay it, and as a result they face a lot of problems later on. Okay, so this has been highlighted by the GAR in its case study. Now when we have to analyze this, so why Deccan region is the most vulnerable? I already told you, one of the most vulnerable because the vagaries of rainfall, then it is vulnerable because of the soil type over there, isn't it? So overall geographical factors and economic factors, they have often been indulging into crops like sugarcane, which is very water intensive. So those are the factors which are accumulating and making the region very vulnerable, isn't it? Then how does droughts affect Indian economy? We have already seen the severe droughts are affecting more than 2 to 5% of GDP. Okay, so how are they impacting? They are impacting because many times what happens, the soil becomes, if you don't have enough water, the soil becomes salty. So agricultural productivity is declined, farmers are not able to sow the seeds, or farmers are not able to get the appropriate harvest, they are not having saving for the next cycle. So all of this has a cumulative effect on the GDP. Okay, then what should be the government's response during drought situation? So the government's response, it has to be multidimensional when we talk about drought, because it is a problem which is multidimensional. It is not something very straight and simple. So the government has to take preparatory measures, it has to take mitigation measures, and it has to take reactive measures also, right? So the government needs to very clearly map which are the vulnerable areas, what is the exact risk which is caused because of droughts, and accordingly they will have to prepare the mitigation plans. Okay, so the government has taken a lot of steps like integrated watershed management. The government has taken steps like the per drop more crop, drip irrigation has been promoted, soil health card scheme, so that people are growing crops which are suited to the soil and they are not very water guzzling. So many steps have been taken by the government in this direction. Okay, ways to reduce drought situation in India. As I told, one of the biggest ways is to spread awareness. First of all, awareness among the stakeholders, among the government, among the people. Then early warning, okay, Then mitigation plans, right? These are the most important steps which are required to be taken. Then you need to reduce demand, aggregate demand for water. This is a very important step. As per their various reports, there was, I think 2019 there was a report of one village in Beed district of Maharashtra. Out of 2000 families, only 15 to 20 families are remaining there. All of them have migrated out just because of lack of water. We are already aware of Cape Town and some other cities in South Africa which had the 0 hour, that is, there is no water left. Chennai had faced a very, very extreme water crisis, I think in 2019 or 2020. So we need to remove or reduce the aggregate demand of water by replacing crops which are less water intensive, by recycling more and more water, isn't it? By conserving water, by harvesting rainwater. All these methods should be adopted and deployed at the same time in an integrated way so that demand comes down. Okay, recharge of aquifers, all of that needs to be done. Okay, now the last is that the Sendai Framework is being linked with the Sustainable Development Goals, and UNDRR is monitoring all of that. What is the Sendai Framework? Now we are just going through in very brief about the Sendai Framework. It has 4 important principles and some 6-7 important goals if you talk about it. So what are the important goals of the Sendai Framework? It talks about reducing the mortality, okay, per lakh people, how many people are dying because of a disaster. Then it talks about reducing the overall impact on number of people during a disaster. Then it talks about reducing the effect on the GDP, on the economy of a country which is affected by a disaster. Then it talks about reducing the impact or damage caused to critical infrastructure. Okay. Then it talks about increasing the number of countries which are having disaster risk mitigation strategies. Okay. Then it talks about monitoring, okay, international cooperation, increasing the international cooperation for disaster risk reduction, and lastly increasing access to early warning and information with regard to disaster. So these are the 7 important principal targets of the Sendai Framework which you need to remember very clearly. So some of them are mentioned over here: number of deaths, missing person, disaster, economic loss in relation to global GDP and damage to infrastructure, then increasing the number of countries with strategies, isn't it, increasing international cooperation and increasing access to early warning. Alright, what are the 4 important principles of this Sendai Framework? The 4 important principles or the priority areas are, understanding disaster risk. You have to understand what are the risks which are being posed by a disaster. Then strengthen the disaster risk governance. Understand the risk, improve and strengthen your risk governance. Then investing in disaster risk reduction strategies, and lastly increasing the preparedness, build back better. So when a disaster has struck, now you have to reconstruct some houses, make them disaster resilient. So whenever you are building back, make them better than they were earlier. Do not indulge in corruption and make poor buildings which will again be destroyed in a very simple disaster, isn't it? So you have to understand the risk, you have to strengthen the risk governance, then you have to build back better, and most importantly you have to invest in disaster risk reduction. And this investment part is where the UN bodies are pitching into, okay, because investment is not possible by many of the poor countries, right? So these are the important points about the Sendai Framework. If you have to remember something about it, it is a framework which was adopted by countries after the in 2015 to 2030, after the Hyogo Framework it lapsed. It was valid for 2000 to 2015. This Sendai Framework is a non-binding framework which has been accepted by countries. It is not binding, it is a non-binding thing, right? So these are the important things. Sustainable Development Goals, you all know, it was adopted after the Rio Plus 20 in 2012, having 17 goals and then various sub goals and sub goals, isn't it? So these are the important points about the GAR, the Global Assessment Report, which we need to be aware of. Okay, with this I wind up this session. I hope you have got the essence of what we were discussing. Thank you everyone.